Welcome everybody to the 5th day of our week on process. Deep dive on the component, and it's a culmination of events. Some of you may have attended some of the earlier events, but our goal today is to get you excited about the process component and give you one last chance to answer any questions that we might help with. And I'll be happy to offer my opinions and my thoughts, but also welcome those from any of you. Because in EOS, we all learn from each other. So I would be excited to hear your views as well as your questions. So before we get started, special welcome to Charlotte Chase, who's the Director of Training at EOS. She'll be really moderating today, and she'll be watching the chat and be able to raise your questions. And Maura Hannum is behind the scenes, ready to help with any technical questions. So hopefully we'll be bug-free. But if you have any, just put them in the chat. The chat will be active, and put your questions there, or also feel free to interrupt. If there's a natural pause, unmute yourself and don't worry about that. It won't throw me off. So we're here about the process component. Yes, I heard somebody start, but not finish. All right. So the hero book of the week is the new process book written by Mike Payton and Lisa Gonzalez. It's a great book. It's got a lot of worksheets, templates, stories, examples, and it really does help this process component come to life. So I encourage you to buy it. I think there's a link, there may be a link in the chat so you can do that, but it is a great addition to the EOS library. I think it's book number 7 now in the library. Also want to make a special note and thank you to our sponsors of the, our sponsors for this, actually for the week, on the process week. So all 3 of these great vendors have tools, electronic tools that can support you in the process component. So special thanks to them for doing that. So the context for the process component is, of course, the EOS model. If everybody would mute themselves so we eliminate background noise, that'd be great. So the EOS model, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because my guess is that most of you are familiar with EOS, the system, also referred to as Traction, which was the name of the book, but the system is EOS, or the Entrepreneurial Operating System. And it was conceived and designed and created by Gino Wickman, because his discovery was most entrepreneurs worry about way too many things at the same time. And to the degree that you can focus on just 6 key components of your business, to that degree, you'll be much more successful. And so those 6 components start with a vision component. The vision component is exactly what the name implies. It's all about where you're going as a company and how you're going to get there. The next component is the people component. And obviously, to get to where you want to be, you have to have the very best people. But the very best people for one company are not the same kind of people that are the very best in another company. And so EOS is designed to help you attract and retain the very best people specifically for your organization. And the next component is the data component. The data component cuts through all the subjectivity and the politics about what's working and what's not working, because the numbers don't lie. So then if you've got clarity on the vision, you've got the great people, and you're making decisions by the numbers, inevitably things get in the way, right? And we call those collectively issues. Some issues are problems, challenges, negative things. Others are simply distractions. Anything that's going to pull you off from achieving your vision, we call those issues. The 5th component is the one we're going to talk about in more depth today, the process component, and that's how you run your business. And the last component is the traction component. That's about accountability and getting results. And it's no accident that vision is at the top and traction is at the bottom, because a vision without traction is wishful thinking. Actually, Gino calls that hallucination. So those are the 6 components of the model. Our focus today is going to be on the process component. And, it's an exciting component, although it's the one that tends to get the least attention in companies, and oftentimes is the one that takes the longest to actually implement. So my goal today is to have you be excited about the process component if you're not already. Because, if you get that 80% right, you're going to grow faster. You're going to attract and keep better people. You're going to create a culture of excellence. You're going to have more time personally. You're going to have happier customers. I think you're going to IDS or solve issues better. I think you're going to make more money. I think your company is going to be more robust, and it's going to have a greater value. And net, it's going to give you a better life as a leader or an owner of your business. So I encourage you to open your minds to the process component, work through some of the myths that you might have in your head, and I'll cover those in a second. But, I'm from Minnesota. Oh, and just a word about me. I'm a Minnesotan. I've spent most of my career before EOS as a turnaround consultant. So I was a hired gun to come in and help companies get better results. When I read the book 10 years ago, I knew from my experience that Gino Wickman had really hit gold, that this was really something that very valuable for entrepreneurial companies. And I've been doing it ever since. It's what I do full time. I've conducted, probably 425 plus sessions over the years. And I'm convinced more and more every day that this is really a gift that we are allowed and blessed to really give to companies. So that's a little bit about me. In Minnesota, we take our beer seriously. Last count, there were about 120 breweries here in Minnesota. So it's a big deal. A friend of mine, a colleague, John Click, is a EOS implementer, great guy, and he has a brewery as a client. So we've had conversations about that. And the brewery business process is a big deal, because making beer is not as easy as it might sound. There's a whole pre-prep process, and then the hops, how hot should it be? How long are when are the hops introduced? How long are they, in there? When do you cool down? How do you cool down, et cetera? So in the midst of all that, you have brewmasters, and brewmasters are the creative ones. So there's a natural conflict. John has a client here in town, and their challenge was they wanted to establish their beers in their tap room. And because customers come to expect a certain beer that they like, and they want that beer to be the same. But the brewmaster is a creative type, and they love to tweak the beers. So the challenge for the brewery was, how do we break through the chaos that's created by the brewmaster who keeps tweaking? And so finally, they got it after about a year of chaos, and they standardized around their process. And they introduced the whole process component. They're an EOS client. They introduced the process component, and all of a sudden the chaos subsided, because customers could come to expect the beers that they wanted. The brewmaster could experiment all he wanted outside of the standard offerings. So the key is, for us in any business, is we want to standardize the things that repeat, so we can humanize the things that don't repeat. Somebody made a great quote about that, to that effect. And so that's what the process component is all about. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So it's all about how you run your business internally. And the steps in that, well, first, the myths. There are some prevalent myths around that. I referred to that earlier. Some of you may have them. Process is not in my nature. And the fact of the matter is that process is really a very intrinsic part of human nature, including entrepreneurs, because we are creatures of habit. And entrepreneurs started their business because they knew how to do something, and they could do it again and again and again. And if it didn't work, they would tweak it until they got it just right. And so for an entrepreneur to say it's not my nature is really not true. And I think it's based upon people confusing process with one of the tools of process, the infamous SOP, or standard operating procedure, which is a 3-inch thick binder that bogs everybody down. And that's not what we're talking about in EOS. So process, in fact, is part of our nature. Another myth: process takes too much time. You know, it's sort of like when people, we tell people in EOS they've got to spend the 90 minutes a week, and they say, oh my gosh, we don't have time to spend 90 minutes a week. We don't have by the same token, they say, we don't have time to document our processes. Well, the fact of the matter is, when it comes to meetings, you're spending that time in the meetings, before the meetings, in the meetings, after the meetings, in the water cooler conversations about why the meeting was so bad. So you're spending that time anyway. Documenting the processes in your company eliminates mistakes. It standardizes things. It makes it easier for people, for new people to come on board. There's just all those benefits that I mentioned before come to place, and it's well worth the time that you have to invest. So in fact, it doesn't take too much time. It saves you time. And the last myth is that it destroys freedom. Just like the brewmaster at the brewery, you know, in fact, introducing the process component at the brewery created more freedom for him to be creative. And that's true for all of us. When we standardize the things that happen on a day-to-day basis, we have more freedom to be creative. And the very best, the very most creative people underneath the surface are very, very disciplined. So those are some of the myths that you have to overcome. So to the process component itself, we say there are a handful of core processes, and that's what we refer to when we talk about core process in EOS. So you usually have a people process, you've got a marketing process, how to get your product out there. You got a sales process, get them to buy your product or your service. In operations, you've got 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 processes. You've got a process around customer service. You got a process around accounting. Right, so that's just an example of the core processes. So the first step is to identify those core processes. And then you want to document those and simplify them. So in documenting, it's very straightforward. If you picture a loose leaf binder, and this can be done electronically, obviously, as well, and that's where the vendors come in, you're going to have a table of contents, which is simply a list of those core processes. And the leadership team has to agree on those processes. It's not something you want to delegate, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the leadership, your leadership team has to agree, these are the core processes by which that makes our company work. And then behind the table of contents, you're going to document and simplify. So for example, in the people process, you're going to have to identify the need, and then you're going to have to define the seat on the accountability chart. You're going to have to go through a hiring process, onboard people, train them. LMA, I'll talk about that in a minute. Termination, and then you do the same thing for the sales process, right? Develop a new lead, initial call, qualify, the meeting to establish a fit, make a proposal, win, lose. That's what we mean by documenting the processes. Typically for any process, it's 2 to 3 pages. So it's not a big, thick SOP. It's a high-level document that sets the expectations, and it doesn't eliminate the creativity or the imaginations of people, but it does set the stage. This is the way we run our business. If you want to work here, this is the way we treat our customers. This is the way we hire and deal with people. This is the way we do operations. This is the way we do our sales, etc. It creates that expectation. So you've got your document with the table of contents and the process documented. We encourage people to name it. So naming it, might be the ABC way or the ABC playbook. One company calls it the ABC secret sauce. But it's a fun way to give visibility to it in your company, is to actually give it a name. This is how we do our business. Okay. Gino Wickman says nothing can be fine-tuned unless it's consistent. Nothing can be fine-tuned unless it's consistent. And so documenting the process doesn't stop there. Once you get it identified, then you have to make it consistent. And by consistent, what we mean is followed by all, or FBA. So once your processes are documented, then you have to go about making sure that they show up day to day, month to month, year in and year out. So there are 4 steps to that. We call it the FBA checklist, followed by all checklists. First of those is to train. So training has got to be a viable part of your organization, and it has to be on an ongoing basis. Although a lot of tools out there for training, it plays an incredibly important role in your company. And it can't be something that's an afterthought. It's got to be a regular part of your culture. You need to train people on the process. And it's going to take some time. In EOS, we say that you need to hear something 7 times before you really get it the first time. So you can't be impatient with the training component. Second, in the checklist for FBA is measure. You have to inspect what you expect. In EOS, we've got the scorecard and measurables. So people have to know, what is their number? You know, when they go home at Friday afternoon and say to their partner or their friends, I had a great week, how do they know it was a great week? They've got to have a way to measure their own performance. And so that's part of the checklist, is making sure that there are measurements in place and they're active and they're accurate. The third checklist on the checklist is LMA. So LMA stands for leading plus managing creates accountability. So what that means is, as supervisors of people, we wear a leadership hat and we wear a management hat. There's some things we do in the leadership area, setting the vision, providing the tools. There's some things we do in wearing our manager hat, and that's like setting expectations, having regular meetings. When you do both things and you've got the right people in the right seats, that's what creates accountability. Part of that LMA process is having quarterly meetings. And so once a quarter, you sit with your direct reports and you have a conversation. How do they show up on their values? How do they show up on their regular performance of their job? How do they show up on their rocks, their projects? And so you're giving them feedback on the processes that are part of how they do their business. So you need to do LMA, you need to do that on a regular basis. And then finally, you need to update the processes. You know, it'd be nice if it was one and done. That's one of the drawbacks of big, thick standard SOPs, is that it's very difficult to update them, but you've got to figure out a way to continually update your processes. That's not easy. It takes a discipline, just like all of EOS takes a discipline. You know, all of this is, yes.
Hey, Ken, excuse me. We have a comment that measurables have been very difficult to for people. They struggle with them the most. Do you want to back up a little bit and talk about that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Measurables are tricky depending upon the position. If you're on an assembly line and you're creating widgets, then it's relatively easy to measure widgets. If you're an engineer in an engineering department, it's a little tougher to come up with the measurables. So there's no easy answer on the measurables component. In EOS, we say everybody has to have a number. In my experience, if you have a number, it may be shared by a team down in the organization, right? So that number, it doesn't have to be unique to you. So, you know, to the question of how do you set measurables when it's not clear and distinct? No easy answer. You know, I think you have a conversation with your direct report, with your direct reports in a given area, and you talk about what would success look like for you, and here's what success looks like for me. There's a great tool in EOS called Getting What You Want, and you start with end result, and then you back up. What are the steps that are needed to get to that end result? And that's what you want to measure. Easiest example is sales, right? In order to get the sales you want, there are certain steps that have to happen. You have to get the leads, you have to make the calls, you have to write the proposals, whatever that is. And that's what you want to measure. So in those areas of your business where it where measurables aren't readily apparent, it takes a conversation. It might be, sometimes it evolves to amount of time that's spent in certain areas. So if it's an engineering function, that you divide the time up between troubleshooting and between product development or whatever's the target, so people don't get sucked into just doing problem solving, that they allocate a certain amount of their time to developing new products. So you set guidelines for that, and that becomes their measurable. But if that's the genesis of your question, no easy answer on that. If you want to talk about that further, put in the chat, Charlotte, you can bring it up again if we need to. Thanks. So to update, back to updating, need to constantly update your process. The beauty of that is that as you update, you're going to make them better because things change. You learn new techniques, you figure out stuff, you get new employees that have a different way of doing things, and you introduce that, you try it out, and then you update your process accordingly. It's a great rejuvenation system if you can dedicate the time and effort to it. Okay, so that's the FBA checklist. And that's the process component in a nutshell. We went through that in about 20 minutes. I think most of you are probably familiar with most of that. Hopefully those of you who are not could keep up. Again, it's common sense. The challenge is to make it common practice. So that's where I'm going to designate the next 10 or 15 minutes. I want to just share some of my experience with clients, and then we'll open it up for questions and Q&A. 100% strong means that you've got 10 to 15 documents and captured 2 to 3 pages per process in some sort of electronic form or paper form. And you have engaged everybody so that those processes are followed by all. That's what it means to be 100% strong in the process component. So overcoming obstacles. Lack of passion. People, sometimes it's hard to get excited about process, right? So it's going to start with you. You've got to really see the benefits of process and be engaged in it and be excited about it. Because if you're not, then the rest of the people in the organization are not. I think sometimes if you can get some early wins, if you can tackle some processes that are problematic in the organization, if there's a process that is a source of errors or a source of stress in the company, if you can get your arms around that, get those processes documented and train people in those so that people see a direct benefit to this effort, that's going to open the door for continuing and tackling other processes. I think you have to address those myths that I talked about. But that passion, that has to be the mindset. This is something that's important to our company. This is what it's going to make. It's going to make us great. The next obstacle is a lack of expertise. People say, "Oh gosh, I'm no process guru. I don't really know how to go about that." You read the book, you listen to a session like today, you do a little bit of studying, and you realize this is not rocket science. And you'd be amazed. There are some people in your company that are really excited about process, who have a vested interest. I have a client right now that one of the VPs, the head of quality, is a process person. And so they're only into their second quarterly or first quarterly. And he's grabbed hold of this and jumped in with both feet. And so his passion, his interest in it and pushing it helps a lot with the whole team come along. You can hire for it. You may have somebody in your organization where you want to make that something that they focus on. And you can also go to outside expertise. There are a lot of people that are invested in process and are very happy to help with it. What I would caution against, though, is abdicating the responsibility for the process component to an outside vendor. Let them help you, but you as an organization have to take hold of it and own it. It's not enough to you can't shove it off onto an outside vendor. Next
We have a-
obstacle. Oh yeah,
Excuse me,
question.
we have a couple of comments.
Yeah, sure.
Don says that he has a rule of thumb. He looks at a few things. One is setting an expectation of how long it takes to perform a process and or the steps within a process. Then measure the length of time to see how you're tracking versus expectations. And then he offers additional help with his LinkedIn profile URL. If you want to comment on that, setting expectations and seeing the length of time spent is tracking versus the expectations.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. That's a great way to measure. Yeah, yeah. And clearly you do need to set that expectation. That's all part of the measurement, is setting those goals. Yeah.
And then the
Setting those targets,
question,
yeah.
Sharon
Yes.
has a question, and it was, I think, dittoed. Yes. So this is a popular question. If 2 to 3 pages is written for each process, what level of detail do you go to? Your example for sales seemed really brief.
Yeah. Yes. Great question. And one that comes up all the time. So every company is different. And the EOS approach to process is at a very high level. So the level of detail, the rule of thumb is 2 or 3 pages per process. So you'd be amazed at what you can cover in 2 or 3 pages. The value is that you're setting expectations. This is the way we run our business. Behind each of those, behind those bullets on your process documentation, if you think of an electronic version, you can have other links that give more detail. And one size does not fit all. I've got a client in the medical device business. So for them, process is a very serious deal because of compliance issues and medical, regulations. So they're going to have a lot more detail behind the 2 to 3 pages for a given process. So the way to incorporate detail is not to expand the 2 or 3 pages, but to go deep wherever you have to. And you go by what your employees require. If you've got a clean room and you've got a set process that people have to follow, then you're obviously going to have more detail. But think of it as a link, think of it as detail behind what we're talking about in EOS. Any other, I'd be open to other thoughts from other people, because that is a very common question. Can you get the value out of such a high level? And the answer is yes, that there's value because a lot of departments don't know what other departments do, right? You'd be surprised when you do this process, how many people say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize there was so much involved in the quality component, or I didn't realize that's what the sales process, that it was so involved. So there's a great awareness that where departments can talk to each other. A lot of times handoffs in businesses are confusing. So when one process stops and the other starts, or sometimes there's a gap. At a client that was inundated with 800 number calls from customer service. So they bring on new customers and the phones would just light up, and they tried to do everything they could to handle all the calls that were coming on the 800 number. So they added extra shifts. They put on more people. They adjusted the times. And as it turned out, when they IDS the issues and attacked the process component, they realized that when they brought on a new customer, the checklist for bringing that new customer was not completed by the sales team. And so when customer service picked up on that customer, they thought that the expectations for what would happen, how the whole process would work with a new client was already covered. But in fact, it wasn't. So as a result, the customer, because they hadn't gone through a checklist of what was expected of them, lit up the phones with the 800 number. So once they got the processes documented and each department understood what the other was going to do, the number of calls decrease dramatically.
Okay, Ken, I've got several questions.
Good.
The first is regarding measurements. Kelly shares that her business is an online community, so she's looking at member engagement numbers, daily, weekly, returning members, etc. And it's been really interesting to pay attention to that on a weekly basis. So
Yeah,
there's
good.
a testimonial for measurables.
Good.
And then we have a question, is going deeper where you have to be considered as, is it considered an SOP then?
You know, when you go, yeah, the short answer is yes. When you go deeper and you've got to, specify exact steps at a detailed level, people tend to call that an SOP. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Kelly shares that something that's helped her is that Stripe, capitalized STRIPE, gives her some fabulous analytics on weekly, monthly, annual basis. So that must be a software tool, I'm guessing.
Or an acronym for something.
Or an acronym for something, yes.
Yeah.
Kelly, if you want to post something explanatory about that, we can share that as well.
That'd be fun. Yeah, yeah.
Aaron wants to know, how do you get people to commit to processes? We have experience, the $1 million question.
Yeah.
We have experienced salespeople who kind of do things their own way. How do we determine the company-wide process?
Yeah, great question. Twofold: how do you get them excited, and then how do you determine best practice? It's an exciting process to determine what your process should be around sales. And the way you do it is pretty straightforward. You get your very best salespeople and you talk to them about what they do and you extract from them. So the most important thing you can do when you develop these processes is listen and observe. Don't come in with a preconceived notion about this should be the best way to do it. Look at those performers. What are they doing? How are they getting the results they're getting? And then in terms of getting people engaged, assuming you've got right people in the right seats, which is a big assumption, right? Then when they see the success of those high performers and you've captured what those high performers are doing, man, that's magic. That's gold for those salespeople who may not be getting those results. If they're not excited about what they're seeing from the high performance, then that's a people issue. But watch and observe, listen to what your high performers are doing. That's going to give you your clue to your processes. Great question. Yeah, thanks.
Don asks or states that he found that process is different from procedure. Procedure is step by step, whereas process are tasks that produce an outcome.
Nice, nice.
Yes, nice distinction there.
That's a nice way to frame it. Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, and Kyle mentions that Aaron, to responding to Aaron, as unfun as it is, you might have the wrong people.
Yeah,
You might.
Yep. And it's not a lot of fun. There's some people that really do get off on it, but it is a lot of work. It's like EOS. EOS isn't a lot of fun, but when you implement EOS, when you got people aligned on the vision, you got the right people in the right seats, you're running your business by the numbers, you're resolving issues, you're documenting your processes, you're having great meetings and living in a 90-degree world, that is fun, right? It's the results that's the fun. So in process, it's the same thing. It's a lot of work. It's no fun to go to the gym, but we all love to weigh 170 pounds and have muscle tone, right? But it's not a lot of fun to go and do crunches or push-ups or run around the track. But we're willing to do it. We're willing to invest in it because we know the results we're going to get. It's the same with EOS in a big frame, because EOS is really just one big process. And it's the same way with the process component. Great insight. Thank you.
And then there's one person who, Kelly's worried about getting into the weeds and going too deep. So how would you stop that?
Start at a high level. Start at a high level and only go as deep as you need to. Right? Yeah, I think it's as simple as that. Where you may find in your 2 or 3 pages, you may find that some of those steps require more detail. They may require more training. They may require a tighter measurement. And so you go into as much detail as you have to, but resist it. Don't start in the detail and work up. Start at a high level and work down as you need to.
That's good advice. And she also mentions that Stripe is her payment processor. So that explains that. And then Don shared a tip with Kelly that finding the balance is key. If it's possible to implement steps into your systems, checklists, etc., your tools guide people to follow the procedure, and hope that helps a little.
Yeah. Great insights.
Yep. Here's a comment from Summer: getting people to follow it, help them see the results they'll achieve. That's good tip.
Yeah.
Okay. And Kelly mentions that the point that she made about Stripe is that most payment processors have analytics in their back end. Sometimes you have to dig. That's true too.
Yeah. There are a lot of tools. You don't want to be over reliant on the technology, but boy, there's a lot of technology that can be very helpful.
Yes. And then let's see. Summer also says she finds it useful for people who realize that they can delegate the tasks they don't want to do by creating processes and SOPs.
Well, that's kind of funny, but there's a lot of truth to that, because as people who are familiar with the EOS know, we talk a lot about delegate and elevate. And what that means is you delegate so that you can elevate yourself to the best use of your time and talent, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times instituting processes gets it out of your head into a documented form, and that allows other people to pick up on it. So there's a lot of wisdom in that little joke. But that leads to another point that I was going to get to later, but I'll cover it right now. And that is, don't abdicate this whole attention to process. Don't dump it down onto your direct reports. You've got to own that at a senior level. People have to see your passion. Obviously, you're going to get the input from people below you, and they're going to know more about the processes than you do. But you've got to be the driver of it. And the reason you don't want to drive it down the organization is that you don't want your performers may not be very good at it. They may be good at giving insight around it, but they're not very good at it. They may not want to do it, and it may not be the best use of their time. If you've got a top salesperson and they're out there selling business, you don't want them spending a ton of time working on the process. Mm-hmm. So don't abdicate the responsibility.
We have several comments about how to get that buy-in because they were shown, the folks were, the sales team in particular, were shown how much easier their jobs would be.
Yeah.
If you can sell them on the amount of time it will save them in the long term, it helps people get excited about creating them.
Yeah. That's exactly right. I'm loving this group, Charlotte.
Yeah. Well, I've got 20 messages here.
Oh,
so
wow. Okay.
Bear with me. I know I'm trying to summarize.
Well, we'll keep an eye on the clock, and I got some other points I want to cover, but I'm loving the interaction. I'm loving the insight from people. That's how we all learn. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, you manage me and tell me when you need to move on.
Yeah.
SOP detail is also similar to work instructions. So seems to be several different things we can call these.
Yes.
And then Tommy states with exclamation points that EOS and process is fun, says an integrator, not a visionary. I think visionaries have a much harder time adopting EOS because they feel it will dampen their visions until they see that EOS provides extreme focus to implement and carry out their visions. Could not have said it better myself.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Well said.
Okay, so then we have some are agreeing with Tommy. And then Kelly's, as a visionary, it's really challenging to break down a process because I just do it. It's why I need an integrator.
That's exactly right. So the concept is to get it out of your head and into the organization. Right. Because it is in the visionary's head. They may say it's not my nature, but it is their nature. It's just in their head. And they're not inclined to take the time to write it down because their attention span is usually a little shorter than most of us.
Mhm. Okay, so, and we're getting to the end here. It can be so overwhelming to see all the moving pieces. Find that visionaries are best at documenting processes when they just verbally talk it through with a VA or someone on their team, and the VA writes out the steps. Then the visionary reviews or revises it.
I think that's a great idea. I
It
think
is,
great.
yeah.
And that's not true just for the visionary. There are a lot of us, there are a lot of people who are more visually oriented or conceptually oriented than detail oriented. So if you can somehow, it's like dictating. For some of us, it's a lot easier to dictate and then look at what's been written and edit it than it is to sit down and write it from scratch. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Yeah.
And
that's a great one.
here's that tip spelled out. Best way for me as a visionary to get it down on paper is to talk to think. I'll often start my phone recorder while I walk or drive and talk it out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
And
And there's a
then,
great software program called Otter, Otter, that allows you to dictate and share the document. And you can see what you're dictating as it appears. And you can also now, you can dictate in a Word document too. That may be common knowledge to everybody. I only found out about a year ago.
it probably only happened not too long before that. Additional tools, and this is the final comment, can be really helpful for this. Scribe How, Loom, Process.st, and click up, and then agreeing with you that Otter is great. So that concludes the comments and questions at this time.
Okay, great, good timing. So I'm going to pick back up on where I was on the slides, the love of complexity. At the other end of the spectrum, you're going to get people in your company that love complexity, high fact finders, and their tendency will be to keep things way too complicated. And the problem with that is it just bogs things down and it doesn't make them sustainable. And so you've got to show people the value in not being so complex. And that's a tough argument because intuitively we think, the more information we have, the better. But the fact of the matter is that it can bog us down. And the idea is to keep it sustainable. So you just gotta talk through it. Yeah. Okay. The next one, over-reliance on technology. We've talked about, I mentioned that before. There is great technology out there, but it's like bringing in an ERP system that most companies fail at that, bringing in an ERP system because they don't clean up their processes before they bring in the ERP. They bring in the ERP and they try to modify the ERP to meet their screwed up processes. And so technology can help, but it's not going to fix things. And again, you don't want to abdicate responsibility for the process component to a piece of software. Kind of syndrome. I love this. In the book, Peyton and Gonzalez talk about this, and it's a really fun part of the book. So I wanted to mention it. So you come into an organization and you start to probe a little bit about their EOS or about their processes and then say, well, do you have L10 meetings? Well, kind of. Well, let's see. So when you hire people, do you review the values? Well, kind of. When you onboard people, do you show them your processes? Long silence. Do you have processes? Well, I think so, right? So it's the kind of syndrome that's going to kill you, right? If you're answering kind of, take a hard look and peel back the onion and say, when we say we're going to document our processes, when we're going to hire, fire, recognize, reward people according to our values, that shows up, that people are doing it. So you look at a leader in the eye and say, after the interview, did you talk about those 5 values? And if they say kind of, address that issue. So it's the kind of syndrome that keeps us in mediocrity. Okay, that's overcoming obstacles, real life. I just put a bunch of bullets here in my experience with clients, and I love the interaction with this group in the last half an hour, so keep that up. Get the process started. I referred earlier, you may take a problem process and work hard at that so people see the benefit of that. When they see errors reduced or customer complaints go down or sales go up because you've identified a process and cleaned it up, that'll generate some enthusiasm. One size doesn't fit all. So I mentioned before the medical device company, for them, their whole process component is going to look a lot different than another client I have. Another client does excavation, so they move dirt, right? So their processes are going to look very different. The level of detail is going to look very different than the medical device company. So one size doesn't fit all. I think, again, in EOS, what we mean by process is high level, 2 to 3 pages, 10 to 15 processes, and then you go deep as you need to. So in companies, you're going to have to go deeper in some areas than in other companies. So one size doesn't fit all. Getting the beer right, we talked about that before, about the brewery. I just told that story earlier. Folks struggle with handoffs, talked about that too. That's a very clear benefit in this whole process component is you make those handoffs crystal clear. Not easy to build a $10 million home. I've got another client that builds multi-million-dollar homes out in Montana and Wyoming. Gorgeous homes, right? And one of their processes is they've got an operations manager, and then they got project managers working on each of these homes. And to build a home like that takes 2 years, right? And so their process, kind of an informal process at first, was that the operations manager once a month would have a one-on meeting with the project manager and go through the details of where the project was. And what they found out was that as the complexity of the business grew, that the operations manager had a hard time keeping up with those monthly calls with the process. And they finally documented it and start to measure those calls and really putting the pressure on the operations manager to make the monthly calls, especially with the new PMs. And then errors went down, job satisfaction went up, profitability on the projects went up. And also an interesting thing, if they missed a call, then all of a sudden it's 2 months goes by. Well, a lot can happen even in a 2-year project in a 60-day period. And if there's a mistake on a job, the homeowner, it's going to require a difficult conversation with that homeowner. So what they found was if they caught it early, like once a month, they raised issues, and then that operations manager said to the project manager, if you need me to have a conversation with you, with the owner, I'll do that. But you've got to get that owner right away. If 2 months goes by, things just are going to get worse, and those difficult conversations become even more difficult. So it's the discipline of staying with the processes that's critical, and that's going to start with you folks as leaders. Not going to happen automatically. Okay, other folks don't have a clue. I mentioned that earlier, that it's amazing you'll find when you document the processes, people say, oh, I didn't know that was involved. I didn't know you did that. Because everybody's focused on their world, and it's hard to understand the fullness of the business. Documenting the processes has a way of expanding on that information. Don't assign the work one level down. I talked about that before. The value of a company is a function of its processes. Obviously, the value of a business is going to be a function of other things too. But, entrepreneurs classically overvalue their businesses. They get to retirement and they think their business is worth, $20 million. Go out to the marketplace that it's worth about $4 million because a lot of the value of the business is wrapped up in their heads and not built into the company itself. And so the process component builds the value of the company because there's something more there than just the energy of the entrepreneur or just the energy of the leadership team, for that matter. The process component gives you substance to your business, gives you something to anchor on. And so that's going to increase the value. Okay. That's what I got. So let's open it up. Charlotte, were there any other questions in Q&A? Or people can just speak up too.
A little while ago, we had a comment about onboarding employees is so very important in this labor market. Employees are looking for companies with core values.
Oh, yeah. Two things there. I think candidates are looking for companies with values. It's amazing the power of that. With all my clients, it's no easy labor market for anybody, but with all my clients, when they talk about the values and the values show up in the halls of the company, it generates an enthusiasm and a positive culture, and candidates are attracted to that. It's not all about wages, and it's not all about jumping ship every 18 months. People will stay with your company if there's something to stay for. I think this environment of the last 10 years and social media just puts more pressure on managers. We've got to do our part. We've got to create an environment that makes people want to stay, because everybody wants to be part of the community. Everybody wants to be recognized. Everybody wants to feel like their talents are recognized and rewarded. And if we do that, I think we'll get the allegiance of people. So I think values plays a huge role. And in terms of onboarding, man, that's a huge benefit, having a process documented. Can you imagine the power? You sit down with someone. Well, number one, onboarding should be one of your processes, right? Probably in the HR world. But can you imagine as part of that process that you can show people, this is the ABC way of doing business. Mm-hmm. They can spend, half a day going through the processes and get a complete picture of the company. What a great gift is that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it can play a big role in onboarding. Thanks.
We have a hand raised here. Summer, if you'd like to go.
Hey, Ken. So we kind of talked about this a little bit, but this is such a good group. I was curious if maybe everybody has a little bit to say, or if anybody has anything to say about it. But so I come in to different companies and I help them as a foundational integrator, like set up the muscles for efficiency and set up like muscles for creating processes and analyzing your team and growing your team in a strategic way and whatever, all those systems and rhythms. But I really find that my clients really struggle with the overcomplexity of creating processes. And so I try to keep it as simple as possible. Like I said, tell me the whole process, we'll write this out. But even still, the steps, they get sticky on the steps. Document those steps. And it becomes really overwhelming because even, the core processes have so many different steps, and those would require maybe a little bit of documentation, screenshots at least, if not a video Loom recording or step-by-step documentation. And then there's all the other day-to-day things that aren't core processes, but still should be documented because they're repeatable or to be delegated to someone. So I was just wondering if anybody had any input on how to make that much less overwhelming and easier. I've created ClickUp boards, and I've created Airtables, and I've created binders and all these different things. I just really want to make it as simple as possible. And that's really why I came. I was like, how can I make this more simple for the visionaries so that they're gung-ho about recording their screen and putting it in the right place and putting it in the flow of what a process is. So anyway, that's it's big.
Yeah. Well, I come back to, I come back to take a step back and force yourself to look at the big picture. Put all that other stuff aside and say, okay, let's get back to basics here. And you may have to do it yourself. You may have to take one of those processes and create 2 to 3 pages looking at the wealth of data you've got, and just take 2 to 3 pages and do it yourself. The other mindset you might try is that picture our process component as kind of the overall umbrella to the wealth of data below it. And you're going to have links. But if you think of, you've got a whole mishmash of data, and what you're going to do is help sort that out and give people a way of accessing that information more easily. because when you have so much stuff, it's hard for people to get access to it. So the framework is the mindset is we're going to simplify things at a high level so we can access the more detail. But I'd love to hear any other thoughts anybody else has about, going from more complex to less complex, because in some ways it's easier to go the other way around.
Mhm.
Anybody in the chat, or just speak up?
Hey, Ken, I just wanted to pop in and give you guys a 5-minute warning. So we're pretty close to wrapping up.
Oh, yeah.
So the next question is probably going to be our last one.
Okay, one more question.
Well, I'll just say something to what Summer just mentioned. I think as a visionary, this is where once I start diving in and doing processes, I start going way too deep. So I think what I'm going to try with my next one is starting with the end result.
Yeah.
One of my processes is I want a new member to know how to navigate my community. So I'm going to start there and I'm going to work backwards.
Yeah.
Only
Yeah.
just, go back. That's all. I'm just going to work backwards.
Yep.
And see if I can do it that way. Because otherwise, if I start from the beginning, I talk too much when I do that.
That's great advice. That is great advice. And that's our, getting what you want tool. That's exactly what it is. And I'd never thought of it as a way of simplifying the way you just articulated, but I think that's great insight. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so Morris says that's where we have to end up because we need to end this on time. So again, thanks to our sponsors. Thank you to Charlotte for doing a great job monitoring. And most of all, thank you to this group. My gosh, I never dreamed it would be as interactive and as much fun as it was. Well, I knew it'd be fun, but yeah. So thank you all for doing that. Best of
The
luck.
end is supposed to be the damn beginning at 4 o'clock.
Oh no, somebody just joined?
Sorry, I did not know that I was on.
That's funny. So sorry. I don't know if I think this is being taped. And I know there are a lot of other resources this week on process. So sorry you just joined, whoever that is, but great to have everybody else on board. Best of luck with your process. My email is on there. I guess my phone number is not, but if I can help in any way, I'd be happy to do that. Just pick up the phone, give a call.